Throughout NASCAR's history, there's been constant changes to the rulebook. Point systems, car specifications, and other miscellaneous rules are ever changing. But a few important rules have remained the same from NASCAR's first race in 1948 to the most recent race from whenever in the future you're watching. There's a scheduled number of laps each race. The winner is the first driver to complete that scheduled distance, or abbreviated distance in the event of rain, well, given that they pass post-race inspection, if NASCAR actually feels like disqualifying them, and sometimes the official winner might have been team ordered into a driver swap on lap 60 of 250. On second thought, almost nothing has remained the same between every race in the sport's history, but for its first 6 decades, qualifying was pretty straightforward. Prior to the race, every driver would take to the track by themselves to record one or multiple timed laps. The driver with the fastest lap would earn the pole position. The next fastest driver would join them on the front row, and so on down the order. It was an infallible format for setting the first 30 or so positions, but there was always a difference of opinions over who should miss the show. In a complete meritocracy, it would make sense for the fastest drivers in order to make the race after any given qualifying session, but it's never been that simple. Fans show up to see their favorite teams and drivers race, and sponsors pay lots of money for their car to be on TV. So if for whatever reason a popular driver or a well-funded driver misses the show, there will be implications depending on how popular or well-funded that driver is. In the worst-case scenario, fans of that unfortunate driver might watch something else on Sunday, or their sponsors might decide to advertise elsewhere, where their brand is guaranteed to be seen. That's a problem NASCAR's always struggled with, and originally they used provisionals to help full-time teams. The rules for provisionals changed frequently over the years, but in general, they left the last few spots on the grid reserved for teams with provisionals who weren't able to lock their way in. Each team would be granted a set number of provisionals at the beginning of the season, and in the event that multiple teams initially failed to lock their way in and all tried to use provisionals, priority would be given based on owners' points. That system ran smoothly for quite a while until 1989 when Richard Petty failed to make the 4th race of this season at Richmond. After a crash in practice, Petty was in the sideline for qualifying and was relying on using a provisional to make the race. However, there were only 2 provisional spots in that 36-car field, and the Yates 28 of Davey Allison and the self-owned 71 of Dave Marcus took them as their entries were scored better than the Petty 43 in owners' points. While Petty hadn't seen victory lane since his 200th and final win back in 1984, and it was clearly past his prime, he still had a devoted fan base and sponsor who were none too pleased to see his streak of 513 consecutive starts come to an end, nor were they when he missed 3 more races that season. While STP remained loyal throughout the rest of Petty's career, NASCAR felt a big enough dip in TV ratings during those 4 kingless races that in 1991 they implemented the past champions provisional, which reserved the final starting spot to a past Cup Series champion like Richard Petty that failed to lock their way in. That rule went without too many problems until the 1997 Fall Charlotte race when 2 past champions, Thierry Labonte and Darrell Waltrip, were both too slow in qualifying and were thus both eligible for the final position provisional. NASCAR gave the spot to Labonte as he was the more recent champion, the defending champion for that matter, but in an effort to protect Waltrip the following season, NASCAR edited the rule. Now, any past champions who failed to lock their way in would first attempt to use an ordinary provisional based on owners' points, and only if they weren't eligible for that either would they have to use the past champions provisional. But as NASCAR soon found out, if you give a washed Darrell Waltrip a cookie, he'll force you to change your rules again, because in 1998 he used a staggering 20 past champions provisionals. With that, NASCAR put their foot down in 1999 and limited past champions to a maximum of 8 special provisionals per season. 4 of which were granted at the start of the season, and 1 additional being granted for each 8 races their team attempted. Those were the same rules as for the ordinary provisionals that year and in years prior, except the past champions provisionals still guaranteed at least a 43rd place starting spot, while an ordinary provisional didn't guarantee a spot in the field at all, depending on a team's situation and owner's points relative to the other teams attempting to use ordinary provisionals. Regardless, the past champion limit led to Waltrip missing 7 races in 1999 and 5 in the year 2000, and with not a single top 10 finish in that span, he finally decided to retire and head to the broadcast booth for 2001. provisionals were a major headache for the bottom half of full-time teams and all of the part-time teams, but for the top 25 in owners' points, there was relatively little concern over using a provisional. While the top 25 teams were also reset to just 4 provisionals at the start of each season, with a chance to earn 4 more as the year went on, they wouldn't lose a provisional when they had to use one. That rule most notably helped out Dale Earnhardt, who used 8 provisionals in both 1998 and 1999, and Matt Kenseth, who used 7 en route to his championship in 2003. For Kenseth, 5 of those provisional usages came in the final 8 races that season, after he had effectively locked up the championship, and his Roush Racing team decided to sandbag the remaining races. It's no wonder that the point system was overhauled the next year. But on the other side of the equation, Jeff Gordon avoided using a single provisional from his debut in 1992 until the 2002 season finale at Homestead. Dale Jarrett was also an all-but mistake-free qualifier in that era, locking in every race without a provisional between the start of 1996 and early 2001. The provisional rules continued to be revised on a near-yearly basis throughout the late 90s and early 2000s, which is why it's hard to talk about them generically without going down a major rabbit hole. But come 2004, one incident would lead NASCAR to finally do away with them. In a stacked 58-car qualifying session at Atlanta, 2 rookies, both named Scott, would fail to make the show. Riggs, driving for MBV Motorsports and Valvoline, and Whitmer, driving for Bill Davis Racing Caterpillar, each had a few provisionals to their name, but all 5 provisional spots were already taken by entries with more owners' points. Then seeing teams with much worse race pace make the show because of their fractionally better qualifying laps, the 2 big-name sponsors allegedly let NASCAR have it, and come 2005, the ordinary provisionals were no more. The new qualifying system instead guaranteed a spot on the grid for all the top 35 teams in owners' points, with the rest of the 43-car field to be set by qualifying times and the past champion's provisional. Fair or not, that system was much more rewarding to the struggling full-time organizations like that of MBV and Bill Davis, which typically still provided bigger names and bigger sponsorships than the part-timers and independents. In practice, the new system essentially just locked 10 more cars into each race, but it brought a true battle to the back of the pack, which had not been seen before. Under the provisional system, the top 25 in owners' points wouldn't lose a provisional if they had to use one, but no one except the top 2 to 6 in points were truly locked in, depending on how many provisionals were available in a particular race. It was all about the qualifying time, and from there a matter of provisionals and owners' points, but in the top 35 system, it was almost all about the owners' points. The battle was on between the worst of the full-time teams to crack the top 35 and get a golden ticket into the next race. If you weren't first, you'd better at least be 35th, because otherwise you'd be competing with every other backmarker or part-time team just to make the field each week. From 2005 through 2012, the 35th spot in owners' points was like a championship for the small teams, and in some years was even more intense than the race for the actual championship. Every year, even under the provisional system, NASCAR used the previous season's owners' points to set the field for the first 5 races of the new season. That was done to prevent high-performing teams from potentially missing one of those races after the points reset, but under the top 35 format, it also locked in some underperforming teams into the same first 5 races. That not only guaranteed them a spot in the Daytona 500, easily the highest-paying race of the year, but it was also a huge confidence booster and sponsorship seller heading into the new season. With all those benefits for staying top 35 in owners' points, there was immense pressure for drivers around that position to keep their car to the good no matter what. More often than not, the 36th place car and all other worst finishing full-time cars would see a new driver the next season, and such fear was definitely present in David Rudiman in the final laps of the 2012 Goody's Fast Relief 500. With a failing car dropping further off the pace each lap, Rudiman knew he had to finish the race at all costs because his Tommy Baldwin Racing number 10 car was dangerously close to the top 35 cut line. As a result, what could have been one of the best finishes in NASCAR history was cut short seconds before Jeff Gordon and Jimmy Johnson took the white flag, and a disastrous green-white checkered attempt followed suit. That moment was the straw that broke the camel's back regarding the top 35 system. As while it was fun for some fans to follow the top 35 battle, it wasn't so fun for the majority to see it bleed out into the actual races and even manipulate race outcomes. The system was also criticized throughout the 2007 season, as it was then that Toyota first entered the Cup Series and failed to make numerous races between their three original teams, two of which, Team Red Bull and Michael Waltrip Racing, were tackling their first full-time Cup season as well, and the only established team was Bill Davis Racing, a single-car operation that had been in sharp decline over the past few years. The Toyota Camry was expectedly a bit slow out of the gate, and with the Red Bull and Waltrip groups also having no meaningful owners' points to fall back on from the year prior, they often had no shot of making the field even when their qualifying times were far ahead of 43rd place. That was because the two Red Bull cars and three Michael Waltrip Racing cars added onto an already overcapacity roster of 45 full-time teams. With the part-timers included, the average number of entrants was even higher, often upwards of 50 in the first half of the season, and so it was a near impossible task for those two teams to consistently make races and crack the top 35. However, both teams were fully funded, and when they did make it past qualifying, they could contend for top 10s here and there, as Brian Vickers recorded 1 top 5 and 4 top 10s for Team Red Bull, and after missing a staggering 11 straight races, even Michael Waltrip recorded 2 top 10s and the pole at Talladega for his own team. At season's end, the Bill Davis number 22, driven by Dave Blaney, was the only Toyota ranked in the top 35 of owners' points, just barely, and after having missed 3 races of their own. Their misfortune was pretty ironic considering they and their sponsor Caterpillar voiced their displeasure about the provisional system after missing just a single race in 2004. While some fans were fed up with the top 35 rule after that season as it barred the new Toyota teams from many more races than the provisional system would have, others became critical of it in the years to come as it apparently made qualifying too boring. The argument was that in qualifying sessions where only 1 or 2 drivers would miss the field, there wasn't enough pressure on the big teams to have to race their way in. I'm not sure I can get behind that personally, but it was an argument NASCAR executives cited when announcing the abandonment of the top 35 system for 2013. They instead returned to a modified provisional system, where in each qualifying session, the quickest 36 drivers would be locked in, and owners' points in the past champions provisional would determine the rest of the starting lineup. But as it turned out, the rule revisions weren't necessary at all that season, because the average number of race entrants was at a major low point. The 2006 season saw 77 cars make at least 1 race attempt, the most of the top 35 system era, but that figure dropped steadily as the sport became less popular and the recession took away a lot of sponsorship. A strong resurgence of Star and Park teams in the 2009 through 2013 seasons took the place of many established teams that went under, but they certainly weren't a good look on the Premier Series, and so NASCAR restructured the prize money system in 2013 to pay significantly less to the near last place finishers each race. That change succeeded in driving out multiple Star and Park teams, but in turn it led to only 50 cars making a race attempt that season, and in each race, including the Daytona 500, there were no more than 2 DNQs. So with entry lists and interest in qualifying, both at the track and at home, reaching a decade low, NASCAR decided that if they could no longer advertise the importance of locking into the race, they might as well make qualifying itself a bit more entertaining. Taking a page out of F1's book, NASCAR implemented knockout-style group qualifying for 2014 to take place in all races except the Daytona 500. The new format had 2 variants. One was for tracks 1.25 miles or longer, where all cars would take to the track for a 25-minute round 1, the fastest 24 would advance onto a 10-minute round 2, and the fastest 12 from round 2 would compete for the pole in a 5-minute round 3. The other variant, for tracks shorter than 1.25 miles and all road courses, consisted of just 2 rounds, a 30-minute round 1 and a 10-minute round 2 for the fastest 12. Also, throughout the entire qualifying session, teams would be allowed to make adjustments to their cars. It was certainly a big change from the standard single-car qualifying procedure, but actually multi-round qualifying had been a part of the sport for quite some time. In the earliest clip of NASCAR qualifying I could find on YouTube, taken from the 1980 Winston 500 at Talladega, the broadcast mentions a second day of qualifying. The qualifying system that year, and likely dating even further back, saw the pole sitter and the rest of the top 20 decided in the first round, while the rest would either stand on their first round time or compete in a second round off of the next day to determine who would make the field and who wouldn't. This 2-day system worked well in the 80s and early 90s because the Truck Series didn't exist yet, and the Busch Grand National Series, which is now the Xfinity Series, typically didn't share weekends with the Cup Series. The system lasted all the way through the year 2000 before the second round was eliminated in 2001, and from then on, the go-or-go-home drivers only had one shot to make the race. That was still the case in 2014, but instead the fastest cars had multiple chances to improve their starting spots. The new group knockout system was met with mixed reaction throughout the first few races, but it certainly drove up both in-person attendance and TV ratings, and it didn't seem to tamper with legitimacy all that much. Nevertheless, there were still two major criticisms from the beginning, first from the big teams. For teams challenging for a spot in the second or final rounds, there was no great way to cool their cars down between rounds, so they resulted in making slow cooldown laps after posting their time, which was a bit of a safety issue considering there were cars all around the track making qualifying laps. NASCAR was quick to take action, and starting with the fourth race of the season at Bristol, they began to allow teams to use an external cooldown unit, albeit with the car's hood still closed. The other major criticism was from the small teams, who previously benefited a lot from single-car qualifying, as they were all but guaranteed a minute of dedicated TV time for their sponsors. But with action scattered all throughout the track in the first round of group qualifying, their chances of receiving any TV time throughout the entire weekend went down significantly. Also, by the 10th round at Talladega, another major flaw of the group knockout system was exposed. It was a complete mess on the super speedways. Because of the group aspect, qualifying there was hardly representative of the car's setup or the driver's ability to hold a clean line, but rather how big of a pack they could squeeze into and get a draft from. From there was more or less a random draw as to which of the drivers in a big pack would get the pole, and any driver unfortunate enough to end up in a small pack or by themselves would be relegated to the back of the grid or an early trip home. For the spring Talladega race, it was the part-timer Brian Scott who turned the fastest lap in the final round amidst a pack of Richard Childress Racing Alliance Chevrolets. There weren't any surprises in the list of drivers who missed the show, but in the fall race, NASCAR faced one of their biggest qualifying embarrassments up to that point. In the first round of qualifying, about half the drivers played chicken in the pits, waiting until the last possible moment to make their qualifying laps. As it turned out, many of those daring drivers did time their laps perfectly, but some of the back of that pack crossed the start-finish line after the timer ran out, and thus their full-speed laps didn't count. Of those were multiple playoff contenders such as Kevin Harvick, Joey Logano, Kyle Busch, and Jeff Gordon, who all had to rely on provisionals to make the race. Then with another playoff driver, Denny Hamlin, posting a miserable lap earlier on, and both Tony Stewart and Kyle Larson, who weren't in the playoffs but whose cars were still relatively high in owners' points, failing to play the clock right as well, all 7 provisional spots were taken by big-name manufacturer-supported teams. And because the 36 fastest cars locked themselves in, multiple slow cars were able to lock their way in just by making a lap at full speed, and so both Ricky Stenhouse Jr. and Justin Allgaier, who also didn't get a lap in, were left on the outside looking in. Stenhouse's Roush 17 and Allgaier's H. Scott 51 were both fully sponsored and inside the top 30 of owners' points, which made their failure to qualify very surprising and controversial. It also highlighted just how close multiple playoff teams were to missing the show alongside them. To make matters even more confusing, later that day the RAB Racing 29 of Joe Nemechek failed inspection and was disqualified, which led to not Stenhouse, not Allgaier, but Reed Sorensen making it back into the field, as he had the next fastest qualifying lap. Despite the controversy from that race, NASCAR doubled down on the group knockout system in 2015 by implementing it into the Daytona 500 pole qualifying. That went just about as well as one could expect after the superspeedway qualifying issues the previous season, as in both the Xfinity Series and Cup Series sessions, there was a multi-car crash in the first round. Who would have guessed there would be such a high potential for crashes when multiple drivers are pack racing to try to lock into the highest paying race of the season? With so much damage expense before the races even started, the teams and drivers made sure to express their opinions to NASCAR on the matter, and not long after, it was announced that single-car qualifying would return to all series for the superspeedway races. In qualifying for the 2015 Pocono 400, mid-session cautions came under criticism when, with 39 seconds to go in the final round, the officials threw a delayed and seemingly unnecessary caution after Denny Hamlin spun by himself. At that point, only 7 cars recorded a full-speed lap, and while cautions froze the clock, the remaining drivers who were all getting up to speed didn't have enough time to get back up to speed when the caution was lifted. And so Joey Logano, who was trekking in the green for the pole at the time of caution, as well as Jimmy Johnson, Kyle Busch, and Kasey Kahne, would line up 9th through 12th behind Denny Hamlin. So while the group knockout system remained polarizing among drivers and fans because of its lack of tradition and the occasional controversies that arose from it, overall it appeared to provide the entertainment NASCAR intended without taking away too much legitimacy from the starting lineup. But come 2019, the general sentiment towards group qualifying took a sharp turn for the worse. It was that year when NASCAR debuted the infamously hated high downforce, low horsepower aero package, which made the cars more dependent on drafting than ever, and in turn increased the games of chicken during qualifying tenfold. And in qualifying for that year's Auto Club 400, it all finally reached a boiling point. In the final round, the first drivers to leave pit road did so with around 45 seconds left on the clock, and with an up-to-speed lap taking around 40 seconds there, not a single driver was even close to crossing the start-finish line before time ran out. Reverting back to second-round times to set the lineup, it was Austin Dillon who got credit for the pole, but even the number 3 team could admit NASCAR's qualifying system was overdue for an update. Group knockout qualifying remained in place for the next few weeks, but as it became more clear the problems weren't going to fix themselves, NASCAR, in unison with the TV networks and race teams, decided to pull the plug and return to single-car, single-round qualifying at all oval tracks, beginning at the Spring Dover race. It was the same formula used from 2001 through 2013, but with a new twist regarding who was locked into the race. Back in 2016, NASCAR developed a charter system, which sought to reward its full-time competitive teams much more than in years prior, and in turn, give significantly less to the backmarkers and part-timers. The top 36 teams from the previous season's owners' points were each granted an equivalent charter, guaranteeing them a base revenue and a spot in every race as long as they showed up to every race and met undisclosed performance requirements. Meanwhile, the last 4 spots in the field were left with the so-called open teams, who would have to race their way into the field amongst themselves and settle for roughly 35% of what the charter teams would earn each race, significantly less than even the last place prize money from 2015. It was an all-out quality over quantity move in an attempt to modernize the sport, but as far as qualifying went, when NASCAR returned to the single-car qualifying in 2019, the charter system brought back the old criticism of the top 35 system, that it's boring to watch single-car qualifying when the vast majority of teams are already locked in. Nevertheless, single-car qualifying stuck around through the rest of 2019 and into 2020 until external factors forced yet another qualifying change. Due to the COVID pandemic in March, practice and qualifying sessions were canceled for nearly every remaining race that season, both to limit human exposure in the garage as well as to speed along the modified schedule, which saw doubleheader weekends and sometimes visits to multiple tracks per week to make up for the over 2-month season postponement. To set the race lineups in these unique race circumstances, NASCAR used random draws where the top 12 charter teams and owners' points would draw for the first 12 positions, with the same concept applying to the 13th through 24th ranked teams and the 25th through 36th ranked teams. Then any open teams would line up 37th through 40th or potentially miss the field, all based on owners' points. Even taking into account the short notice NASCAR had to devise a modified starting lineup system, the random draws were one of the most deeply flawed formats in the sport's history. Starting at the front of the pack, the difference between one spot in owners' points, 12th or 13th, was the difference between potentially starting on the front row or starting in 24th, all based on luck. Additionally, the open teams such as Daniel Suarez and the Gaunt Brothers 96 were screwed week in and week out, lining up in the final 2 rows each race, regardless of the speed they brought to the track. That was, unless the race was the second one of a doubleheader, in which case the top 20 of the first race's finishing order was inverted to create the top 20 of the second race's starting order, with the 21st through 40th place finishers starting the second race in those non-inverted positions. Thankfully for the outside of the top 12 teams, NASCAR implemented a new starting lineup formula at a little over halfway through this season, which took into account multiple performance-based factors. Finishing position from the previous race weighted at 50%, ranking and owners' points weighted at 35%, and ranking of fastest lap from the previous race weighted at 15%. It wasn't perfect, but it was a breath of fresh air at the time after months of sole reliance on owners' points and blind luck. For 2021, the performance metrics formula continued to be used in most races, with exceptions for either classic races or races at tracks new to the Cup Series schedule. In those exceptions, standard single-car qualifying was used on the ovals, and 2-round group knockout qualifying was used on the road courses, the same procedure set in place back in 2019. During the two pandemic-affected seasons, a broader debate sprung up amongst teams and fans over whether practice and qualifying were even necessary at all. On one hand, they help teams and drivers, especially inexperienced ones, feel out the track before race day and make critical adjustments, as well as allow newer part-time teams a relatively fair shot at making the field of any given race. But on the other hand, the absence of practice and qualifying was a big cost saver, and the performance metrics formula system was a fairly legitimate way to set the starting lineup amongst the full-time teams. In a way, NASCAR met in the middle in 2022 by bringing back qualifying sessions prior to every race, but also significantly decreasing practice time compared to the pre-pandemic years. Alongside the unveiling of the new Gen 7 car was also the unveiling of the qualifying system that is currently used as of this recording, the Group A and B system, or at least the first version of it in all of its overly complicated glory. On short tracks and intermediate ovals, every team was split into a Group A or Group B based on even or odd ranking from the prior performance metrics formula. From there, cars in Group A would take to the track first, going out one at a time to record one or two timed laps depending on the track, with the cars in Group B following suit afterwards. The fastest 5 cars from each group then advanced to a final round, where each of them would make another timed lap or two, one at a time, with the fastest car in the final round winning the pole and the slowest still being guaranteed 10th place. On the road courses, the field was also split into 2 groups, but rather than single car qualifying, each group went out all at once in 15-minute sessions, and the fastest 5 from each group transferred into a 10-minute final round. Then at the super speedways, there were no groups at all, and every car just recorded a single timed lap, one at a time, and then the fastest 10 transferred to the final round to make another single timed lap. Lastly, for the Bristol Dirt Race, the field was set based on 4 heat races, similar to the inaugural race in 2021. But this added complexity was all for naught, as it neither added meaningful entertainment value nor produced more legitimate starting lineups, rather it was just a big headache. The Group A and B aspect was especially problem-ridden, as it became apparent pretty quickly that the Group B teams had a major advantage over Group A teams thanks to being granted live SMT data from the Group A session, and thanks to the track having more rubber laid down by the time it was their turn. While the top 5 fastest from each group had the opportunity to reset and compete against each other in one final round session, the 11th through 40th positions oftentimes saw heavy influence based on the groups. In the 2023 Spring Las Vegas race, for example, Group B drivers made up every starting position from 11th to 15th before the fastest Group A driver to miss the final round lined up in 16th. To combat this imbalance, NASCAR tweaked the Group A and B format ahead of the 2024 season, to where the 6th quickest through the slowest Group A drivers would all line up on the outside line, and the 6th quickest through slowest Group B drivers all on the inside line. At the start of this season, the final round was left alone, with the top 10 still being decided purely on time, but as various factors such as changing track conditions and cooldown time between rounds continued to create imbalances, NASCAR applied a similar principle to the final round. Beginning at around the midpoint of this season at New Hampshire, the front row was forced to include a driver from both groups, with the fastest driver overall in the final round winning the pole and the fastest driver of the other group starting alongside them. From there, Group B drivers would fill up the inside line, and Group A drivers would fill up the outside line from the 2nd row to the 5th row. As of this recording, those are the current rules, but they will probably be changed yet again in the near future because for one reason or another, NASCAR has dug themselves into a hole of ridiculously complicated qualifying rules. With significant controversy and now lawsuits emerging over the charge system as well, it is also more than likely the sport will see another change in how teams are or are not locked into the field. But at the end of the day, there haven't been any overcapacity entry lists besides the Daytona 500s for the entire Gen 7 era, and starting positions in NASCAR don't matter nearly as much as in any other motorsport, so it really isn't worth worrying about all that much. With 33 of the 36 races this season in the books, only one time has a race winner won from the pole, and the average starting spot for race winners has been 10.2. That said, I've covered about everything I thought to be important in the history of NASCAR qualifying, so let me know your thoughts on all the systems that have been used over the years, and what you think about the current one. Should it be left alone, or should it be revamped yet again? Also, apologies for the near month-long break between uploads. I've been extremely busy in college recently, and I expect to be even more busy in the coming months, so I'll try to keep uploading here and there as much as possible, but it's pretty hard to. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, please make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more videos just like these. But until next time, peace out.